In today's video, I will begin my story about how Islam transformed from a small cult into a religion that conquered billions of hearts, how it all began and what difficulties its founder had to face, and how the ideas of the Prophet Muhammad began to form the foundations of a great civilization. So, my name is Semyon and welcome to the Amazing History channel, where we tell you about the most interesting moments from the history of the ancient world and the Middle Ages. Subscribe, comment, and like, and let's get started with the topic of this episode. Muhammad was born around the year 570 in Mecca and came from the Quraysh tribe, and his family was actively involved in the social and political life of the region and engaged in trade. Mecca was an important religious center, with many temples where numerous nomadic tribes worshipped their gods. Allah was considered the greatest of these gods, but many tribes were actually polytheists. Muhammad lost his father before he was born, and his mother died when he was about 6 years old. Then the boy was taken into the care of his grandfather, Abd al-Muttalib. He was the leader of the Hashim clan. Unfortunately, after a couple of years, he also passed away, and Muhammad came under the care of his paternal uncle Abu Talib, who was an ordinary merchant. In his teenage years, Muhammad began working as a shepherd and accompanied his uncle's caravans to various places, including northern Syria. Thanks to his honesty and reliability, he was given the nickname Al-Amin, which in Arabic means honest or trustworthy. Muhammad was about 40 years old when he began to have strange dreams and visions, which made him believe that he was the prophet of Allah. Tormented by these visions, he would leave his family for long periods and wander alone in the nearby mountains. According to Islamic tradition, in the year 610, while meditating in a cave on Mount Jabal an-Nur, Muhammad was visited by the archangel Jibril. He received the first revelations from Allah, which later became the foundation of the Quran, the holy text of Islam. After the first revelation, Muhammad realized that he needed to convey these messages to others. At first, he shared his experiences and messages with close relatives, starting with his wife Khadija, who supported him. Then he turned to his close friend Abu Bakr, who also accepted Islam. Soon, Muhammad began telling more and more people, and he gained a small number of followers. Muhammad's teachings were very simple and understandable to any Bedouin. Muhammad considered himself only a prophet through whom God revealed the truth to people. He never claimed anything more than that. For example, he never attributed any superhuman dignity to himself and only guided people to the truth he received through divine revelations. However, because his message was monotheistic and condemned the worship of other gods, it caused dissatisfaction among the majority of the tribes in Mecca, who were still polytheists. The reasons for their dissatisfaction were not only religious beliefs, but also economic issues. Muhammad spoke out against idol worship, which negatively affected the Meccan merchants who served thousands of pilgrims coming to Mecca every year to visit their shrines. Some of these merchants were even from the same tribe as Muhammad himself, and they tried to persuade him to stop his preaching. But nothing could stop Muhammad. For about 3 years, he and his followers lived in Mecca as outcasts. The rest of the people of Mecca agreed not to marry them, not to sell them anything, and not to buy anything from them. But the boycott did not achieve its goal. In 619, Abu Talib and Khadija died one after the other. Abu Lahab became the new head of the Hashim clan, a longtime enemy of Muhammad. After that, his life in Mecca became even more unbearable, but Muhammad continued his mission. He began preaching among the pilgrims who arrived in the city in large numbers. His speeches soon made an impression on a group of Arabs from Yathrib, and they hurried to bring the news to their hometown about the new teaching that had appeared in Mecca. Soon, 12 noble citizens from this city came to Mecca, accepted Islam, and asked Muhammad for a mentor. He sent Musab ibn Umair with them, and 2 years later, after all the Arabs of Yathrib became Muslims, Muhammad was invited to become their religious teacher and leader. Muhammad lived in Mecca for another 3 months after that, gradually sending his followers to Yathrib. Abu Lahab and the Quraysh soon noticed the disappearance of Muhammad's followers and became alarmed. They did not like the growing influence of the Muslims. Muhammad was being watched, and it was no longer safe for him to stay in Mecca. To disguise his escape, the Prophet went to Abu Bakr, who had long kept camels ready at a distant pasture. At night, they secretly left the city and after a few days arrived in Yathrib. This significant event was called the Hijra, the migration. The year of the Hijra became the first year of the Islamic lunar calendar. The Hijra was not only an act of physical relocation, but also symbolized a new beginning for the Muslim community and for the spread of Islam. The first actions of Muhammad as the leader of Yathrib were more political than religious in nature. He managed to reconcile all the tribes of the oasis and put an end to their bloody feud. Marriages were arranged between the Muhajirun, Muslim immigrants from Mecca, and the Ansar, Muslims from Yathrib, which helped strengthen the social bond between these groups. A joint defense agreement was also concluded with the three Jewish tribes, Banu Nadir, Banu Kainuka, and Banu Qurayza, living in the city. From then on, all the people of Yathrib had to act together against external threats. The Prophet's mosque was also built in the city, which served as a courtyard, headquarters, and of course a spiritual center. When the position of the Prophet in Yathrib was strengthened, he began to confront Mecca. At the beginning of 624, a group of Muslims managed to capture a Meccan caravan. After that, in March of the same year, Muhammad gathered a large force to attack another caravan, which included more than 1,000 camels. It is worth noting that the Muslims attacked only the Quraysh caravans. This could also have been due to the fact that after the flight, the Muslims left a lot of property in Mecca, which enterprising Meccans were selling off left and right. This was a kind of compensation for the losses. When the Meccans learned about Muhammad's preparations, they immediately gathered an army and hurried to help their fellow tribesmen. It so happened that the very cause of the conflict, a wealthy caravan, managed to escape from Muhammad, but both hostile armies met in the village of Badr. Muhammad had about 300 men with him, while the Meccans had about 1,000. Although no more than 1,500 people took part in the battle on both sides, by the standards of that time, it was a major event. At first, according to Arab military tradition, 3 men from each side were chosen for an opening duel. One of these brave men was the young Ali ibn Abu Talib, who later became the 4th rightly guided caliph. The opening duel ended with a victory for the Muslims. Then, after that, both armies rushed towards each other. There is even a tradition that during this battle, Muhammad picked up a handful of dust from the ground and threw it at the opponents, filling their eyes and noses, which gave his people an advantage. The battle cry of the Muslims was Allahu Akbar. The victory at Badr made a great impression on contemporaries. Muhammad's authority increased tremendously. Even his place of residence began to be considered sacred. Yathrib, once an ordinary settlement, became the city of the Prophet for Muslims. Al-Madina an-Nabawiyya, commonly known as Medina, the Jewish tribe of Banu Kainuka, was expelled from Medina. As a result of their violation of the agreement, their lands and property were divided among Muhammad's companions. Meanwhile, the Meccans were plotting revenge. They appointed Abu Sufyan Sakhr as their commander. He managed to gather an army that reached 3,000 men. In March 625, this army marched towards Medina. Muhammad learned about the enemy's approach only when they were a few hours away from the oasis. That's why the Muslim army barely had 1,000 men. The second battle, the Battle of Uhud. Despite being outnumbered by the enemy, the Muslims immediately seized the initiative and began to push back the Meccans. As a result, the enemy camp was left unprotected. However, when the Muslims left their fortifications to storm the Meccan camp, an unexpected cavalry attack by the enemy caused confusion in their ranks. The Meccans killed many Muslim warriors and severely wounded Muhammad himself. The Muslims were forced to retreat to the mountain, and the Meccans took this as a sign of their ultimate victory. They considered themselves triumphant and left, leaving Muhammad and his troops to pick up the pieces of this terrible and unexpected defeat. Upon returning from the campaign, the Muslims expelled the second Jewish tribe, Banu Nadir, from Medina, suspecting them of plotting an assassination attempt against the Prophet. However, Banu Nadir did not accept the loss of their victory. They joined the coalition of Muhammad's enemies that the Meccans were assembling. Other nomadic Arab tribes also joined this alliance, so the total number of troops reached 10,000. The gathering of such a large number of warriors could not go unnoticed. Muhammad learned about everything in advance and managed to gather about 3,000 of his supporters. On the most accessible site to the north of Medina, the Muslims dug a trench about 6 meters long. Moreover, the Prophet dug alongside everyone else. On March 31st, 627, the Meccans approached Medina and began its siege. 10 days passed in minor skirmishes. The enemy was probing for weak spots in the defense of the people of Medina, but they were vigilant, and the coalition of besiegers began to fall apart. In the end, only the Meccans themselves remained, who insisted on continuing the siege. Muhammad and his troops used surprise tactics and ultimately won, and the Meccans retreated. Immediately after their departure, Muhammad besieged the settlement of the third Jewish tribe in Medina, Banu Qurayza, which had been conducting separate negotiations with the enemies and almost joined their side. This time, those involved in the betrayal were treated much more harshly. Many men were executed. In March 628, Muhammad announced his intention to perform the Hajj in Mecca. More than 1,000 people accompanied him on the pilgrimage. Muhammad sent Uthman to negotiate with the Meccans. It is unknown what influenced them more, the persuasion of Uthman, who was respected by everyone, or the fear of a new battle. But the Meccans agreed to make peace with Muhammad for 10 years, although they did not allow him to enter the city this time. Meccan's allies were allowed to enter into alliances with Muhammad. Many of his closest companions wondered what the Muslims had gained from this peace. But Muhammad saw further than they did, and his whole demeanor conveyed satisfaction. Without approaching the Kaaba, he performed all the required rituals and returned to Medina. He already considered it a great victory that he was recognized as an equal party, and the permission for the allies of the Meccans to join either side was essentially granted. This meant the collapse of the treaty system on which the power of Mecca was based. By the beginning of 630, the allies of the Meccans had already violated the new agreements, and Muhammad began preparing for another major campaign against Mecca. In January of the same year, a 10,000-strong Muslim army set out on its way, gaining the support of more and more tribes along the route. By the time they reached the city, the Meccans fully realized that they no longer had the advantage in strength and allowed Muhammad to enter their city almost without resistance. Many residents of Mecca even began to convert to Islam, as in a short time the Muslims became the dominant community in Arabia. Over the next 2 years, Muhammad returned to Medina, where he continued to live, but kept working on uniting the entire Arabian Peninsula under the rule of Islam. In the spring of 1632, Muhammad set out at the head of 14,000 Muslims from Medina to perform the Hajj in Mecca. On the 9th day of the month of Dhu al-Hijjah, Muhammad invited all the Muslims who had come to Mecca for the Hajj to Jabal al-Rahman at Arafat, where he delivered his famous final sermon. Tens of thousands of followers joined him on his final pilgrimage before he returned home. Muhammad fell ill soon after arriving in Medina and died from the illness on June 8, 1632. When Muhammad died, Abu Bakr became his successor, although not as a prophet. It is believed that prophethood ended with Muhammad, but Abu Bakr, with the consent of the Muslim community of Medina, took the title of Caliph instead. Thus, Abu Bakr became the first rightly guided caliph. This was an important step in the formation of the Islamic State. Abu Bakr led the Muslim communities, resolved issues of doctrine, and also dealt with the organization of the internal and external affairs of the Islamic State. But not everything went smoothly. Some leaders of the Arab tribes believed that after the death of Muhammad, it was no longer necessary to obey Caliph Abu Bakr. They broke ties with the caliphate, declaring that their loyalty to Muhammad was purely personal, and some leaders even went so far as to proclaim themselves successors to the prophet in prophethood, which became the reason for the break. The new caliph needed to show strength. Wars with the apostates began. Through military action and diplomacy, Abu Bakr and his people managed to quickly suppress the rebellion and strengthen their power on the Arabian Peninsula. After that, he shifted his attention to expanding and strengthening the Islamic State in other regions. At the end of Abu Bakr's rule, an important stage in the history of the Muslim conquest began, covering the territories of Iraq and Syria. Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha, a local Arab leader, told Abu Bakr about the prospects for successful conquests in Iraq against the Sassanians. And the Caliph, realizing the importance of this moment, sent his experienced commander Khalid ibn al-Walid to explore the possibilities. At the same time, in 633, Abu Bakr sent another detachment to Syria with a similar objective. Both missions, which began as simple raids, quickly turned into a large-scale conquest. There arose a need to protect Muslim territories from possible intervention by the Byzantine Empire, and Abu Bakr called on Khalid to direct his forces to Syria. Despite the numerical superiority of the Byzantines, the Muslims, led by Khalid, demonstrated military skill and defeated the enemy in the Battle of Ajnadain. One of the main reasons why the Byzantine forces were surprisingly easily defeated may be the fact that they expected to fight only a small detachment of local Arab tribes. Byzantine sources downplay the results of the Battle of Ajnadain, while Muslim sources recall the decisive victory with perhaps excessive enthusiasm, claiming that the Byzantine side lost about 50,000 men by the end of the battle. In any case, just a few months after the conflict, Abu Bakr died of natural causes. Umar took his place and continued an active policy of conquest. Despite Khalid's active participation in the victorious struggle against the Byzantines, the new caliph decided to replace him with another commander, Abu Ubaidah. Ubaidah was appointed governor of conquered Syria. In the same year, the Muslims took Damascus. The following year, they defeated the Byzantines. They captured the garrison in Palestine, and in 636 they took Emesa. By this time, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius was furious and ready to put an end to the Arab expansion. Once again, the Byzantines significantly outnumbered the Muslim forces who were scattered throughout Syria. The Byzantines were joined by combined forces of Greeks, Armenians, Georgians, Franks, and Ghassanids, commanded by the military leader Theodore, as well as the Armenian military leader Vahan. The Byzantine forces numbered about 40,000 men, while the Muslims had between 20,000 and 25,000 men remaining. The situation was complicated by the Byzantines' desire to coordinate their attack with their allies from the Sassanid Empire. Meanwhile, Ubaidah, who lacked sufficient experience and confidence, handed command of the Muslim forces back to Khalid, who had already clearly established himself as an experienced and victorious commander. Khalid quickly withdrew his troops to the plateau beyond the Yarmouk River, which he believed served as the best position for the Caliphate's army. The Byzantines, meanwhile, began to show impatience toward the Sassanids, who insisted that they were not yet ready to assist their allies. Therefore, the Byzantines decided to advance on their own. In the spring of 636, they moved south and occupied Emesa and Damascus. After that, they did not undertake any offensive actions for a long time. Initially, both the Muslims and the Byzantines were ready for a compromise. Negotiations lasted for about 3 months. As a result, this delay allowed the Muslims to receive greater support from Medina. And both sides, in the end, grew weary of waiting and prepared for battle. The Byzantine army formed a 13-kilometer front about 1.5 kilometers from the Arab positions. On the first day, after cavalry attacks from both sides, the Byzantine left flank attacked the right flank of the Arab army. 2 attacks were repelled. But after the third attack, the Yemenis ran toward the camp and the Byzantines rushed after them. When the retreating soldiers reached their camp, they were met with scolding from the Arab women. After that, they came to their senses and began to defend themselves. The arriving cavalry drove the Byzantines back to their original position. The Byzantines' attempt to break the left flank also failed. The next day, they made another unsuccessful attempt to attack through the center. Despite heavy losses, on the third day of battle, the Arab cavalry managed to break through the left flank of the Byzantines and get behind their lines. This caused panic and a chaotic retreat. Poor coordination between the units of the Byzantine army led to their successful actions on the left flank and in the center, preventing them from responding in time to the Arab counterattack. And on the fourth and decisive day of the battle, each of its surviving units acted independently. After suffering heavy losses on August 19th, the leader of the Armenians, Vahan, who was operating in the center, sent an emissary to the Muslim camp to negotiate a truce. Realizing that victory was near, Khalid rejected the offer, and on August 20, 636, he launched a decisive attack, ordering the infantry to advance along the entire front. With a massive cavalry attack, he crushed the left flank of the Byzantines and began pushing them back toward the steep slopes. After that, the cavalry broke through the right flank and by outflanking it, cut off the Byzantines' retreat to the north. In addition, a separate cavalry detachment of 500 men was sent to the only bridge across the Yarmouk. By capturing it, the Arabs encircled the remnants of the Byzantine army. As a result, the Byzantines were defeated during their retreat, while the Muslims achieved another victory, suffering only about 4,000 casualties. Thanks to this victory, the Rashidun Caliphate was able to claim full control over the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula. Soon after that, in 637, the holy city of Jerusalem itself agreed to surrender to the Caliph, having received a promise of safety. As for the heroic Khalid, his brilliant efforts went unappreciated. When he returned to Caliph Umar, he was again relieved of all his duties. Why did this happen? Was it out of envy? Most likely the real reason for Khalid's dismissal was to preserve religious purity and faith. Not a personal conflict. After so many victories that were considered impossible, people began to praise Khalid too much because he truly was a military genius. But Umar did not want Khalid's victories to make people give too much honor to Khalid instead of Allah. Thus, Umar declared that it was God who brought victory to the Muslims, not Khalid and his tactics. Nevertheless, Khalid refused to rebel against Caliph Umar and take revenge on him. He calmly resigned, demonstrating his commitment to the principles and unity of the Muslim community. When he died in 642 in Emesa, which is now the city of Homs, a mosque bearing his name was built over his burial site in memory of the great commander. Since the death of Prophet Mukaira, after the victory, and until Khalid's resignation, the Muslims spread their power and religion from Medina throughout the entire Arabian Peninsula and Lebanon, and they had no intention of stopping there. One of the main reasons why the Caliphate probably achieved decisive success in its early conquests was that the population of the lands held by the Byzantine Empire was dissatisfied with its rule. This motivated many to embrace Islam and join the ranks of the Muslims, as an opportunity to escape Byzantine oppression. Moreover, judging by the statements of Caliph Umar, the real military capabilities and strategic mastery of Khalid turned out to be key factors in the rapid success. His experience and tactical mastery allowed the Muslims to effectively deal with the enemy's numerical superiority. The initial successful conquests created favorable conditions for the Muslims to continue their expansion, both within the Middle East and beyond its borders. After the conquests of Syria and Palestine, it was Egypt's turn. As of 639, Egypt was in the hands of the Byzantine Empire, which had taken it back from the Sassanid Empire about 10 years earlier. However, While fighting each other, these two strong regional powers overlooked the Arab invasion and lost the Levant as a result. In December 639, the Arab general Amr ibn al-As led an army of 4,000 toward the Egyptian border to continue the Muslim expansion. Amr had visited Egypt many times before Islam as a merchant and was well aware of the country's wealth and its roads. Over time, he gained combat experience by participating in wars against apostates and in the conquest of Syria and Palestine. Amr's campaign might never have happened because after the capture of Jerusalem 2 years earlier, the Muslim army was seriously weakened by the plague. However, it is believed that Amr's personal ambitions played a role in the decision to embark on such a risky campaign. Most likely, Caliph Umar did not give permission for the campaign. When he learned that the detachment had left, he became concerned that his men, being so few in number, would not be able to take such a vast territory from the Byzantines. Therefore, he sent a letter after them in which he ordered Amr to return home immediately unless he had already entered Egypt. The messenger caught up with him near the Egyptian border in the region of Rafah. Amr, of course, guessed the contents of the letter and did not want to abandon his intended goal, so he resorted to a trick. He ordered the army to quicken its pace and told the messenger that he would open the letter when the army stopped for the night, at the end of the day. The messenger was completely unaware of the contents of the message and readily agreed to follow alongside the army until their day's journey was over. Amr made sure the warriors kept moving until they reached Egyptian soil, and eventually they stopped not far from the city of El Arish. Amr finally agreed to open the caliph's letter and informed his soldiers of its contents, asking them to think about what they should do next. As he expected, everyone agreed that since they were already practically on Egyptian territory, there was no reason to turn back. Amr sent a message to the caliph and continued on his way, encountering no resistance from the local inhabitants. At the end of December or the beginning of January 640, the Arabs reached the fortress of Pelusium, also known as the Eastern Gate, in Egypt. Due to Amr's lack of siege equipment, the siege lasted for almost 2 months. In the end, the fortress was taken and its walls were demolished, since Amr had no opportunity to leave a garrison there. The Arabs' first success attracted a large number of Sinai Bedouins to their ranks, which helped them make up for the losses they suffered during the siege. Next, Amr sent his troops to build base for the next siege. Unlike in Pelusium, here the Byzantines put up significant resistance to the invading Arabs. Cyrus, the prefect of Egypt and the patriarch of Alexandria, even tried to negotiate with the Muslims to resolve the conflict in a more peaceful way. Amr agreed to the talks, and then Cyrus was joined. 2 monks and the general Artion, the former prefect of Jerusalem, joined him. Amr offered them 3 options: to accept Islam, to pay the jizya, or to fight. Otherwise, he would continue the siege. Cyrus first asked for 3 days to consider the deal, then requested an extension for another 2 days, after which he decided that it would be best to pay the jizya. However, Artion and the monks did not support the ruler's decision and refused to make a deal with Amr. The battle began. The Byzantines were defeated, Artion was killed, and Cyrus went to the Babylon fortress, not to be confused with Babylon in Mesopotamia. After defeating the Byzantine forces, the Muslims tried to win over the local Egyptian population, but the Egyptians refused to surrender Belbais. The Arabs were forced to continue the siege until March of 640, when they finally managed to capture the city. Next, the Arab commander set his sights on the Babylon fortress. It was a strong fortress that protected the southern part of the Nile Delta. Its walls were about 18 meters high and more than 2 meters thick. The Byzantines were prepared for a siege and began to repel all attempts by the Arabs to advance and break through the fortress. By July, Amr realized that the battle had reached a stalemate for him. He sent a message to Caliph Umar requesting reinforcements, which the Caliph had already dispatched by the time the letter was received. 4,000 new warriors under the command of Az-Zubair arrived at Babylon to assist in the siege. Many of them had already fought during the Syrian campaign of the famous Khalid, but the Arabs still could not achieve success in the struggle for Babylon. Then Amr and Az-Zubair decided to launch a preemptive strike on the city of Heliopolis, which was located about 15 kilometers from Babylon. They feared that the Byzantine troops from Heliopolis might attack them from the rear while the Arabs were occupied with the siege of Babylon. With a decisive attack, the Arabs managed to catch the garrison of Heliopolis by surprise. Az-Zubair, with a handful of men, climbed the fortifications of Heliopolis and engaged the guards in battle. In the end, they achieved victory and opened the city gates for the rest of the warriors. Having completely taken control of Heliopolis, the Arab commanders turned back to Babylon to finish it once and for all. Just a month later, the Caliph sent another reinforcement of 4,000 men. Thus, the total number of Muslims had already reached about 12,000 warriors. Meanwhile, the Byzantine garrison in Fayum received news of the fall of Heliopolis and suddenly abandoned their posts without warning the townspeople of their actions. This gave Amr the opportunity to send part of his troops across the Nile to capture Fayum and the surrounding territories with almost no resistance. Meanwhile, the siege of Babylon continued. The Byzantines made a bold sortie, which turned into a complete disaster. During one of these attacks, the Muslim troops surrounded the Byzantines and struck from three sides. After suffering heavy losses, they were forced to retreat to their fortress and abandon further offensive actions. The besiegers resumed negotiations with Cyrus, and Amr personally met with the Byzantine commander Theodoros. The negotiations did not bring any significant progress, and the Arabs grew weary of the prolonged siege. Finally, at the end of December, under the cover of night, Az-Zubair led an elite group of troops right up to the city walls. He acted according to the same plan he had used earlier in Heliopolis. Az-Zubair was once again able to scale the walls with his men, overcome the guards, and open the city gates for the rest of the army. After 2 days, Cyrus realized that the battle was lost and agreed to a peace settlement with the Muslims, according to which all of Egypt was to be handed over to Caliph Umar. He also agreed to pay the jizya at the rate of 2 dinars for every adult male. Of course, Kir did not have the authority to make such deals. The agreement had to be approved by the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius. Cyrus assured Amr and Al-Zubair that if Emperor Heraclius refused to ratify the agreement, he and the Egyptians would still abide by its terms. When Heraclius learned about this, he was furious. Heraclius sent Cyrus a letter full of insults, calling him a miserable coward and a pagan. Cyrus was summoned to Constantinople, where he was put on trial. The emperor accused him of treason and then had him imprisoned. Then Heraclius began assembling a large army in Constantinople, intending to personally lead a campaign to Egypt. And it's unknown how all of this would have ended if not for his sudden death in February 641. The assembled troops scattered during the ensuing succession crisis, and no help came to Egypt. However, during his brief reign, the new emperor managed to release Cyrus as he understood his motives for making the agreement and sent him back to Alexandria. Meanwhile, while people in Constantinople were sorting out their differences, the Muslims were not wasting any time. After capturing Babylon, they moved towards the city of Alexandria. This was a key port through which supplies and communication with the capital of Byzantium were maintained. If the city were captured, any attempts by the Byzantines to drive the Arabs out of Egypt would come to an end. The Byzantines tried to push the Muslims back on their way to Alexandria, but the Muslims gradually advanced closer and closer to the city, and by March 641, they had already begun the siege of Alexandria. After studying the situation, Amr realized that conquering Alexandria would not be easy. The Byzantines were determined to put up fierce resistance against the Muslims. They set up catapults on the city walls and started hurling stones at the Muslims, forcing Amr to retreat beyond their range. The ensuing battle went back and forth, but after 6 months, the Muslims had not achieved any significant results. Caliph Umar began to grow impatient. In a letter addressed to Amr, the Caliph, concerned about the excessive delay, appointed Ubaida as the new commander of the forces besieging the fortress. By that time, Cyrus returned to Alexandria from exile with the authority to make peace with the Arabs. There was a power struggle in Constantinople, and they had no time for such trifles as Alexandria. Cyrus went to Babylon to see Amr. The negotiations lasted quite a long time, and in November 641 peace was concluded. The city had to pay tribute. An 11-month truce was established until September 642. During this period, the Byzantine troops had to leave Alexandria with all their belongings. The Arabs, on the other hand, occupy all the positions they managed to take, and neither side would undertake any military action. They also pledged not to seize churches and not to interfere in the affairs of Christians. As a result, in September 642, the last Byzantine troops left Alexandria and Amar's troops entered the city. The surrender of Alexandria marked the actual end of Byzantine resistance and the beginning of Muslim rule in Egypt. The Arabs continued their conquests in North Africa, becoming a rapidly growing power, and nothing could stop them. By the beginning of the reign of Uthman, the third rightly guided caliph, the Muslims already controlled vast territories, the entire Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, and Syria. However, they did not intend to stop there, and the new caliph continued to advance further into the rapidly collapsing Sassanid Empire. But despite all the military victories of the caliphate during the 12-year reign of Uthman, his domestic policy would soon lead to internal turmoil in the young and rapidly growing state. Nepotism and the unpopular economic policies of Uthman began to provoke growing opposition to his rule from various segments of society. Uthman began to centralize power, relying on his Umayyad relatives and excluding other Quraishites from the power structure, who had enjoyed significant authority during the reigns of his two predecessors. Under Uthman, a new class of wealthy former warriors emerged who became owners of vast tracts of land in Syria and Persia with luxurious estates. This taste for luxury among the conquerors led to an increase in taxes and caused strong discontent both among non-Muslims and among newly converted Arabs. In addition to economic tensions, Uthman also created a single official version of the Quran, which also led to theological disagreements. After all, before that, all the revelations of the Prophet were recorded and transmitted by his closest companions, so there were several versions with minor differences in the text which undermined faith. To fix the situation, Uthman instructed a gathering of religious scholars to determine the canonical wording of the Prophet's words. All other versions of the Quran were destroyed. Today, Uthman's Quran remains the unchanged sacred text for Muslims around the world, but during his rule, some Muslims disagreed with the decisions made by Uthman's scholars. They also considered the destruction of any Quran to be sacrilege, adding their voices to the growing opposition to his rule. The long-standing discontent with Caliph Uthman erupted into open rebellion in 656. In Egypt, Kufa, and Basra, about 500 dissatisfied soldiers from the local garrisons gathered and marched on Medina, demanding the deposition of Uthman and the election of a new caliph. Refusing to step down as caliph, Uthman tried to reach a peaceful settlement by sending Ali ibn Abu Talib, the Prophet's son-in-law and one of the first Muslims, to negotiate with the rebels on his behalf. In the end, the soldiers from Kufa and Basra were persuaded to make peace with Uthman, and the soldiers from Egypt were promised that Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr, the son of the first caliph, would be appointed as the new governor. Ali acted as the guarantor of the agreement. This satisfied the rebels, and they began to return to Egypt. But on their way back, they were overtaken by a messenger of Uthman who was heading to Egypt. They decided to stop him and search him. They found an order with the messenger instructing the Egyptian governor to execute the leaders of the rebels. Taking this as a sign of treachery from Uthman, the rebels returned to Medina and laid siege to his house. It remains unclear whether Uthman actually ordered the execution of the rebels. One version is that the letter was not written by Uthman, but by his cousin and secretary Marwan ibn al-Hakam. But whatever the truth was, the rebels cut off the water supply to Uthman's house and made increasingly threatening demands for him to abdicate the throne. The blockade lasted for about 40 days until on June 16th, one of Marwan's servants killed a representative of the rebels with a stone from the balcony, making a bloody outcome almost inevitable. The next day on Friday, June 17, the rebels attacked Hakam's house. Uthman ordered his defenders to lay down their arms and not to fight, as he did not want bloodshed. Nevertheless, some of them, including Marwan and the sons of Ali, did not obey this order and tried to save the life of their caliph. When Uthman was sitting for the noon prayer, Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr and several Egyptian rebels entered his house from the roof of a neighboring house, threatening the caliph with the point of a sword. Although sources differ in their opinions about this event and the role of Ibn Abu Bakr in it, the final result was the same. Uthman became the first caliph to be killed by his fellow believers, and this event shook the Muslim world to its core. After the assassination, the rebel groups effectively controlled Medina, and under their influence, Ali was elevated to the rank of caliph. It seemed that he was a safe and popular choice. However, the scandal surrounding Uthman's murder put the new caliph in a difficult position. Considering Ali's efforts to defuse the rebellion and the injuries his own son Hassan sustained while defending Uthman, it is unlikely that he played any role in the murder of his predecessor. But many of the rebels who had opposed Uthman were now his main supporters. He could not punish them, as this would have led to the rejection of his authority and possibly to his own demise. On the other hand, the Umayyads, representatives of Uthman's powerful clan, demanded the punishment of those guilty of the murder. Finding himself trapped, Ali allowed Uthman's murder to go unpunished, which led to accusations of weakness and complicity, especially from the Umayyads, laying the foundation for the First Islamic Civil War. The first signs of conflict came from Talha ibn Ubaidullah and Az-Zubair ibn al-Awwam, Ali's main rivals in the election. In the past, these two fought alongside Ali as comrades. But despite the fact that Talha had previously opposed Uthman, they were among the most active supporters of fighting the rebels. And they quickly found common ground with another opponent of Ali, Aisha, the widow of the Prophet himself. Since Aisha was the unifying spiritual leader of the uprising, she was financed by numerous Umayyad governors who had been overthrown by Ali at the beginning of his rule. Several prominent Muslim leaders, including Marwan, rallied under her banner, and Mecca became the center of the uprising. As part of the preparations for battle, Aisha, Az-Zubair, and Talha led a detachment of several hundred warriors to the city of Basra. According to one account, in the settlement of Hawab on the way to Basra, Aisha was disheartened by the incessant howling of dogs. This reminded her of the ominous warning given by Prophet Muhammad to his wives many years ago. A day will come when the dogs of Hawab will bark at one of you, and on that day, the one subjected to this barking will be deeply misguided. She considered it a bad omen and even planned to leave the group, but Talha and Az-Zubair persuaded her not to. These two were constantly arguing about who should be the leader, both in battle and in everyday life. Upon arriving in the city, Talha and Az-Zubair went to the market, where they began calling people to arms. But the people of Basra were divided in their opinions. Some supported them while others condemned them. In the end, this resulted in a major brawl between the supporters of Aisha and Ali. However, more important than the market brawl was the reaction of the governor of Basra, who remained loyal to Ali. Not wanting to allow bloodshed in his city, he allowed the rebels to set up camp outside its borders. He himself was waiting for news from Ali, who was on his way from Medina. Soon, a message arrived from the caliph, instructing him to give the rebels an ultimatum: loyalty to Ali or war. But by that time, the rebels had already settled in a fortified camp. It should be noted that even after the assassination of Caliph Uthman, the idea of open war between Muslims remained almost unthinkable for most people. Therefore, a messenger was sent to the rebels with a final plea for peace and an end to the uprising. After the plea was refused, the garrison of Basra attacked the rebels. A short and bloody battle broke out around Aisha's camp. Many people died on both sides, but the rebels were not driven out. After that, a difficult truce was signed, which was supposed to last until Ali's arrival. However, the truce did not last long. The rebels understood that with the arrival of Ali's forces, they would be outnumbered. Therefore, on Talha's advice, the group of rebels made a sortie and captured the governor of Basra during the evening prayer in the mosque. They subjected him to 40 lashes, plucked out his beard and eyelashes, and then put him in custody. The next morning, the rebels attacked the food warehouse, killed 40 people outside, and seized the grain intended for the city's winter provisions. In response, about 700 warriors from Basra attacked the rebels, but were quickly surrounded and overwhelmed by the larger rebel army. After that, they took full control of Basra. Before Ali's arrival, the rebels did not have much time left to gather support for their movement. Although control over the city and its treasury brought most of the surrounding tribes at least nominally under Aisha's banner, the emissaries sent north to Kufa had less success. The governor of Kufa politely declined Aisha's request, trying to maintain neutrality. However, when Ali's son, Hassan, arrived in Kufa seeking support, he was quickly overthrown and more than 6,000 men were gathered to take Basra. Adding to them 700 men from Medina and about 2,000 gathered from various tribes along the way, Ali arrived in Basra on December 5th. In total, he had about 10,000 men, which was comparable in number to Aisha's army made up of people from Basra and Mecca. A tent was set up between the armies, where negotiations between Talha, Az-Zubair, and Ali took place for 3 days. The parties tried to reach an agreement and avoid war, but they didn't come to any conclusion. In a final attempt to avoid bloodshed, Ali ordered one of his men to carry a copy of the Quran between the lines of warriors on the tip of a spear, appealing for adherence to its teachings. However, the rebels responded by killing this warrior with an arrow. Then Ali gave the order to begin the attack. Aisha was led off the battlefield riding a camel. It was in honor of this animal that the battle got its name. For some unknown reason, Az-Zubair abandoned his army and retreated at the beginning of the battle. According to one version, secret correspondence with Ali convinced him that he had chosen the wrong path. Another version says Aisha refused to proclaim him caliph on the eve of the battle. It was said that she preferred Talha over him, and that Az-Zubair's role in the uprising was a selfish attempt to seize the throne. Either way, his desertion left Talha in command in a rapidly deteriorating situation. In the end, the rebels were defeated. Various figures are given for the casualties, but the commonly accepted numbers are around 400 for Ali's army and between 2,000 and 2,500 for Aisha's army. So what happened to the remaining rebel leaders after that? Talha was killed, but not by Ali's troops. He was killed by his ally Marwan, who was taking revenge on him for inciting the murder of Uthman. Marwan himself was captured and pardoned, but later he switched sides again to support Muawiyah, the governor of Syria, who refused to recognize Ali. Az-Zubair was found by 3 tribesmen shortly after the battle ended and was killed while attempting a rebellion. Aisha also fell into Ali's hands while fleeing to Muawiyah, but he acted mercifully and sent her to Medina accompanied by her brother, where she lived out her days in comfort without actively participating in political life. So, before I continue telling you about the events of the first Fitna, let's go back for a while before the death of Uthman to find out what role the Umayyad clan played in all of this, who rose from a wealthy Meccan family to become rulers of the caliphate. In pre-Islamic Arabia, life was sharply divided along clan lines, but in the early caliphate under the first 2 righteous caliphs, brotherhood in Islam replaced the tribal loyalty that had existed before. The caliphate was organized on principles of justice and Islamic unity inherited from the Prophet. Governance was carried out mainly through the consensus of the companions in Medina. Becoming the first caliph, Abu Bakr emphasized in his speech to the gathered Muslims of Medina that he was not the greatest among them, and that he would welcome the help and advice of his subjects even if it went against his own suggestions. And although Abu Bakr had adult sons, he handed the caliphate over to his advisor and companion Umar and did not try to create a ruling dynasty. Umar, as is well known, led the same modest lifestyle as caliph as he did before, sleeping on a bed of palm leaves and taking part in the same work as his subjects, helping those in need. However, under Uthman, clan traditions from the pre-Islamic past began to return, and nepotism flourished. His relatives often received lucrative and influential positions. For example, the conqueror of Egypt, Amr ibn al-As, whom I mentioned in one of my previous videos, was replaced by Abdullah ibn Sa'd, Uthman's milk brother. This caused dissatisfaction among other companions of the Prophet and the residents of Medina, who saw that they were being denied promotions in favor of Uthman's relatives. Soon, because of this, the Umayyad clan became one of the most powerful political groups in the caliphate, where the rulers of numerous distant provinces were bound by family ties and were ready to resist any threat to their shared power. And here, the most prominent figure in all of this becomes Uthman's cousin, Muawiyah, who was once a minor religious governor during Umar's time, and to whom Uthman handed over all of Syria. Possession of such a wealthy region made Muawiyah the most influential member of the powerful family and the most likely rival to Ali after Uthman's assassination. Thus, conflict between these two was inevitable. As soon as Ali became caliph, he issued an order to depose Muawiyah and many other governors appointed by Uthman. However, Muawiyah was already confident enough in his power to ignore the order. Other deposed governors began to gather around him. Surprisingly, Amr ibn al-As also joined him. Yes, the same Amr who was removed by Uthman. He was very popular in Egypt, which made him the perfect candidate to wrest the richest province of the caliphate from Ali's hands. After Amr received assurance from Muawiyah that if they won, he would make him the governor of Egypt, Amr arrived in Damascus. According to medieval historians, after Amr appeared on the political scene, anti-Ali propaganda intensified in Syria. The Syrians were being persuaded that Ali was an accomplice in the murder of Uthman. Amr also helped Muawiyah form an important alliance with the most powerful tribe of Yemen, the Himyarites, who once ruled their own independent kingdom in pre-Islamic times. Caliph Ali understood that there was no time to delay and something had to be done. Therefore, in May of the year 657, he left Medina with his troops to remove the rebellious governor. Before Ali reached the area of Siffin on the right bank of the Euphrates, a series of skirmishes took place between their troops as the two sides tested each other's strength. When Ali's army finally arrived at the Euphrates, they found that the Syrian cavalry was blocking their only access to the water. Ali asked Muawiyah to allow his water carriers access to the water, but he refused this request, recalling how their opponents had deprived Caliph Uthman of water. This was done against Amr's advice and turned out to be a mistake on Muawiyah's part. When Ali gathered his troops to march against Muawiyah, it was difficult for him to motivate his men, as many did not want bloodshed between fellow believers. But Muawiyah's ill-considered attempt to deprive his enemies of water in the desert heat cost his army any sympathy among Ali's ranks and marked the beginning of a bloody confrontation. The size of the armies on both sides is a matter of debate. Al-Tabari estimates Ali's army at 70,000 men. This is most likely an exaggerated figure, considering that far fewer people took part in the Battle of the Camel. But even if we accept a more conservative estimate of 20 to 30,000 for Ali, given that Muawiyah's army was much larger, the Battle of Siffin became one of the largest and most significant battles in the history of Islam, and it took place in several stages over the course of the following weeks. Discovering that access to water was blocked, Ali's vanguard attacked the Syrians who were blocking their way and pushed them back, providing water to the army that was tormented by thirst. This time, Muawiyah had to worry about providing water for his army. Unlike Muawiyah, the Caliph allowed the Syrians access to the water, although many in his circle criticized this overly noble act. After that, the army spent 2 days in a tense standoff, and after unsuccessful negotiations, there was more than a week of daily raids and personal duels between noble warriors, which continued until June 18, when each army tested the strength of the other, but was not willing to fully commit. On June 19th, a new ceasefire agreement was reached, which lasted for more than a month. In a final attempt to reach a peace agreement, or at least to persuade the leaders of the opposing sides to switch to the enemy's side. But these attempts were no more successful than the previous ones. For weeks, envoys went back and forth between the two armies with messages and bribes, but the stalemate remained almost unchanged. There is plenty of historical material about the Battle of Sefene, but it often describes scattered episodes of the war. Nevertheless, it can be said with some confidence that the battle began at Sefene on Wednesday, July 26, 657. It lasted for 3 days and 3 nights, almost without interruption. The first day of the battle was inconclusive. It mostly consisted of exchanging arrows and cavalry raids. The losses were mounting, but neither side was able to gain a decisive advantage. According to Al-Tabari, Ali fought alongside his men on the front lines when the main battle broke out. Meanwhile, Muawiyah was commanding from his tent. On the second day, Muawiyah concentrated his attack on Ali's right flank and came close to defeating it. However, the reinforcements that arrived were able to stop the advance of the Syrians. Moreover, in their counterattack, Ali's supporters even reached Muawiyah's tent, forcing him to take cover in the army tent, but they were stopped by Muawiyah's elite troops. On the third day, Muawiyah doubled his efforts to break Ali's right flank by sending his Himyarite allies against it. However, this time Ali's right flank held firm, inflicting heavy losses on them. With the break of day, both armies became fully engaged in a general battle. The duels, maneuvers, and archery that had characterized the previous days were replaced by chaotic clashes of swords and spears, which continued throughout the night. With the arrival of morning, after the bloodiest night of the civil war, Ali's army seemed to be gaining the upper hand, pushing Muawiyah's troops back and even forcing him to move his tent to a safer place after another attack on the camp. Ultimately, the outcome of the battle was not decided by strength of arms. With the arrival of morning, several of Muawiyah's messengers rode between the armies with Qurans on their spears as a sign of truce, appealing to Ali and asking him to allow mandatory arbitration to resolve the dispute between him and Muawiyah. Although Ali had the advantage in battle, many of his soldiers were exhausted after the long fight and did not want to continue fighting against their fellow believers. Considered the proposal a worthy alternative to further fighting and ignored the calls of Malik al-Ashtar and others to continue the battle. Ali, whose hands were tied, accepted Muawiyah's truce and the call for arbitration, bringing the battle to an end. Each side appointed an arbitrator, Amr ibn al-As for Muawiyah, and the former governor of Kufa, Abu Musa al-Ashari, for Ali, who, despite his personal enmity with Ali, had the support of the army, which consisted mainly of people from Kufa. Both armies left the battlefield, agreeing that in the coming months, both arbitrators would meet to fairly judge Uthman's murder and determine who the rightful caliph was, guided by the Quran. However, some of Ali's supporters strongly opposed the arbitration, considering it a betrayal of God to hand over the decision to fallible people instead of letting Allah choose the victor on the battlefield. Before Abu Musa went to the first round of arbitration, some of Ali's followers demanded that Ali abandon the negotiations and return to war with Muawiyah. Ali reproached them, stating that he would have preferred to continue the battle at Siffin, but now he was obliged to abide by the agreements that had been reached. Not satisfied with this, they adopted the slogan, "Authority belongs only to God." And over the following months, new supporters came around to their point of view, who came to be called Kharijitis, from the Arabic verb kharaja, meaning to leave or to rebel. After Ali's troops returned to Kufa, the Kharijitis became a real headache for him. They criticized Ali when he led prayers in the mosque and declared both him and Muawiyah unfit to rule. As discontent grew, the two arbitrators met twice during the following year, each time for several weeks in a row. And eventually, they delivered a verdict in favor of Muawiyah, ruling to remove Ali from the position of caliph in April 658. Ali refused to comply with this decision, declaring it more of a political move than a true religious judgment. But by doing this, Ali greatly undermined his own legitimacy and weakened his position in the ongoing confrontation with Muawiyah. Meanwhile, in Kufa, the Kharijiti movement turned from a small group of dissatisfied people into a full-scale uprising. Leaving Kufa in small groups to avoid detection, they headed to the Nahrawan Canal on the eastern bank of the Tigris to regroup. Along the way, about 500 more people from Basra joined them. Ali quickly left Kufa in pursuit of the Kharijitis and arrived at their camp in July 658. Despite their treachery, Ali tried to avoid battle, pointing out that he was now ready to resume the war with Muawiyah as they had wished, and asked them to return to his side. Some did so, but the majority of the approximately 2,000 rebels stubbornly held their ground, which led to some disagreements within Ali's ranks. Many of his supporters believed that the Kharijitis were a minor problem and should simply be ignored until Muawiyah was defeated. But after several local residents were killed by the Kharijitis, Ali responded quickly. On July 17th, his much larger army engaged them in battle and easily defeated them. In the following 2.5 years of uneasy truce, Muawiyah became even more significant. He overthrew the governor of Egypt, Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr, and gave this position to Amr, returning power to him as promised. He also formed new alliances throughout the caliphate, many of whose members now considered him the legitimate caliph. At the beginning of the year 661, after receiving advice from his remaining supporters, Ali decided to launch a second invasion of Syria, while he still had the strength to challenge Muawiyah. Ali began gathering his troops to prepare for the new campaign, but the planned offensive never took place. On January 26, 661, Ali entered the Great Mosque of Kufa to perform the traditional morning prayer. During the ceremony, the Kharijite Abdurrahman ibn Muljam attacked him from behind with a poisoned sword, mortally wounding the caliph and avenging his fallen comrades. 2 days later, Ali died from his wounds. After his death, there were few left who could deprive Muawiyah of the caliphate. Ali's eldest son, Hassan, was forced to renounce his claims to the throne, and Muawiyah seized power with almost no resistance. Besides the simple change of leader, the first Fitna, as the civil war came to be called, would have a huge impact on the history of Islam. It split the religious and cultural movement that, when united, had conquered powerful empires. The nature of leadership in the caliphate also changed. The elections that brought the first 4 caliphs to power would give way to dynastic succession. Power would remain in the hands of the Umayyad clan for the next 90 years, marking the end of the Rashidun Caliphate. That's all from me. If you want to see more videos about the early history of Islam, let me know in the comments. And also share the video. But for now, I'll say goodbye. See you next time.